Okay, thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you everyone for attending the session. It's a great pleasure to discuss this interesting report, especially after being away from maternity leave for about 8 months. I haven't read literature, so it was very good to see the overview of what has happened in between. So I'm very happy that I had the opportunity to do so. So the report basically has its two parts as presented. So I'll comment on both parts respectively. But because there were many papers overviewed in the report and many results happening, I'm just going to maybe highlight some of the main findings, unless you skip some of them, because I think these are the most important ones also in the policy debate. So regarding the labor market effect of immigration, as Anthony has presented, it very much depends on the skills of migrants and the existing workers. So the skill composition of the receiving society, but also the arriving migrants is important. And how, and how substitutable the two groups are makes a difference, as well as the flexibility of the labor markets to be able to adapt to the changes, to the arrivals of the migrants. The second main finding, or actually this is the overall finding of all the papers that has been kind of overviewed, is that there's kind of actually almost no effect of immigrants on the labor markets, and if any, it's slightly positive. So there has been various approaches used to come to this conclusion, like the spatial correlation approach, structural methods, as well as the natural experiments, as they call it in the literature. Except that, in the natural experiment case, the long run results are negligible, the outcomes are negligible, but the short run effects are negative, of course, which has been shown in the evidence, for example, in France after the Algerian independence. And then another important finding that perhaps also leads to the public debate is that if there is any wage effect, then it is mainly on the immigrants who are already in the country, or who are on the people who are closest to the newly arriving immigrants. So this could be the low-skilled natives in the receiving country, or it could be the other migrants already in the country who are competing with the new arrivals. So these are the population groups who are affected the most if there is any effect on the labor markets. So I understand that the focus was mainly on wages and employment when you write the report, but I still wanted to highlight a few other aspects which are still within the labor market aspects and domains, but not perhaps very much looked at in this report. So first of all, this is on the approach. So the report mainly focuses on the individual level effects, so the wages, employment. But we know that there is a lot of literature also on the macroeconomic effects of immigration and how immigration can increase, for example, GDP per capita. There is a recent paper by Jomot et al. From IMF that shows that. And this is mainly through increasing the labor productivity thanks to immigration of high-skilled labor. Another aspect, other than wages and employment, will be perhaps you could also add some papers looking at those other types of employments, for example, other types of labor market outcomes. For example, the self-employment is an important dimension of economic activity, and there's a literature that says that immigrants tend to be more entrepreneurial and more self-employed, so that can generate jobs and that's also good for the labor market and the whole economy. That's something that I haven't seen in the report. But of course, you cannot do everything in one report, but perhaps a couple of paragraphs could be spent there. This is maybe a secondary effect, but still important. The effect of immigration on the labor force participation of the natives, and especially the female natives. So there's the literature that, for example, finds that native women tend to participate more in the labor force because the arriving immigrants kind of help them to in the childcare or housework so that native women can go and work. So there's this complementarity. You kind of touched upon this, but I just highlight the specific an aspect of it. And then the innovation aspect, how immigrants are bringing in skills that lead to innovation and growth. Okay, so we understood, and it's been also well established by now, that it's hard to find causal effects. That's why there are those various methods to find the impact exactly coming from the immigrants on the labor markets. But I still wanted to highlight some of the challenges that could be mentioned, perhaps, and could be considered. So other than the methods that have been suggested, there's still this notion that migrants are mobile in the first place. So migrants are migrants, so they tend to go wherever opportunities are interesting for them. So that's why immigration could be both a cause and an effect of the changes in the labor markets. So this is a bit the hard part of disentangling this effect from the causes. And at the same time, natives also move. So as a response to arrival of immigrants, native can also change where they want to go, and so the actual effects could be hidden by this kind of, let's say, internal migration within the country, or even international migration of natives as well. And then another challenge is that various labor market effects of immigration are materialized at different time horizons, depending on the economic circumstances of the country as well as the skill composition of the receiving country. So this is basically referring to the issue that some of the effects that you find are short-term, but then they tend to disappear over time. So there's this dynamic aspect of how the effects are materialized. And then the other challenge is the diverse motivation of the immigrants themselves. So migrants come to a country for various reasons. They could be economic migrants, student migrants, family migrants, or political migrants, and so on. So this has implications for the different types of investments that they could pursue in the receiving country, and that can also have effects on the labor markets. So, for example, if you are a political migrant, maybe you have no return intention, so you may want to invest more in the local or receiving country specific human capital than if you are a family migrant and you think that, okay, at some point in time I'll go back home. So you have different strategies of investment, and that will have implications on the impact of immigration in the labor market in the receiving country in general. So this is a bit hard to capture as information, because most of the data that we have, we are not able to distinguish why people come in the first place. So we just know that they're immigrants, but we don't know most of the time. I mean, there are some surveys that capture that, but it's hard. And I think it provides additional insights on the impacts that we could see. Okay, some policy implication. Of course, the facilitating or promoting legal migration, mainly employment-based, can provide Europe or the receiving countries with skills that are necessary in the labor market, because there could be some labor shortages, and that could contribute overall to the sustainability of the welfare system. So this is something that to consider in the policy aspect. More maybe specifically, there could be more tailored, targeted labor market policies that would reap all the benefits of immigration in the labor markets, such as enhancing the labor market flexibility in receiving countries to improve not just immigrant integration, but also to kind of adjust to this sudden shocks with negative wage effects. So how firms respond to this kind of shocks, for example. So making labor markets more flexible could perhaps help avoid even the short-run negative effects. Then I was thinking of the active labor market policies as a way to help the low-wage, low-skilled or inactive individuals who are competing with the newly arrived or with the arriving immigrants. And then the firms also, this is related to the firms or the industry side. So they, of course, would like to know, or they want to have an expectation of how much or how many immigrants from what skills could come, some kind of estimation. So this is possible if there is better data and forecasting on immigration so that they can adjust their production plans. So if there is some close connection with the private sector, with industry, on how to manage this migration flow, I think that can also have good impact on the labor markets in general. And finally, some support to the local authorities with high immigration rates will be necessary so that they have sufficient resources to be able to support and provide services, such as training programs, not just for the immigrants, but also perhaps for the natives as well. This is actually related to the active labor market policy as well. Okay, so now I will move on to the part 2, which looks at the impact of immigration on attitudes, preferences, and electoral outcomes, presented by Andreas. To sum very quickly this recently rising literature, the results are that unlike what most of the people think, the cultural concerns are the main driving force behind skepticism towards immigration, while the fiscal or labor market concerns play a secondary role. This is surprising because if you look at the public discourse, everyone talks about immigrants stealing the jobs. So that's why we may have certain criticism against or skepticism about immigration. But actually, it's not just this, and there's some other identity issues that seem to drive those kind of attitudes. Also, a very interesting finding is on the skill level of the natives and how that determines or influences the way they feel about immigrants. And in particular, you've shown some papers finding that more educated individuals place greater value on cultural diversity than less educated individuals. So this is also something interesting and perhaps gives hope for the future. And then this is the third finding that I found very interesting that relates actually to a bit to the first one, is that the natives' concerns about the negative externalities, for example, for childcare and schooling, so these are the compositional amenities, seem to play a more important role in shaping the electoral support for anti-immigration parties. So this is, again, it's not about immigrants stealing jobs, but it's more about whether you send your child to a school with where there are many more immigrants there. That kind of drives how you feel about them. And the last finding that I want to highlight is on this contact theory, which I find very interesting, actually. I wasn't aware of it. I think it's coming from sociological literature in the first place. But I think you do a very nice application of this in the economic field, which basically looks at the different types of exposure to refugees and how you are in contact with them determines your attitudes toward them. So this could be not just refugees, it could be any immigrant, actually. And so this is also interesting finding. So the challenges ahead, before I move on with the policy implications. So this is unfortunate, but there seems to be a big disconnect between the academic research findings and what people perceive in everyday life when it comes to immigration. So these perceptions versus the facts, there is a gap in between, and I think that kind of is at the root of this rise of the extreme right-wing parties and support for them and so on. Then the problem, which is now being improved, I think, is on the issues of the good quality data and how attitudes are measured. So nowadays we have better data. We have various surveys that can address these problems, but it used to be not available before, and also how you measure attitudes is also a little bit of sometimes a bit tricky, So when people are asked, okay, what do you feel about a migrant or neighbor or something like that? So one day you might be in a good mood and you say, yes, I like them a lot, or the other day, I mean, the moods are a bit changing, and how people respond to these surveys is sometimes just posing questions on how these feelings are actually measured. In that sense, I think the voting outcomes are a bit more reliable. I guess they're a bit more stable than the moods. And it's a good measure of the revealed preferences. It's a good alternative. But again, depending on the context and the skill composition of the migrants, as you mentioned several times, it's still very hard to disentangle various factors and then the impact of these factors on immigration sentiments in general. And these various factors are economic, cultural factors, and the problem is that they feed each other. Okay, I'm almost done. So some policy implications on this aspect, the attitudes, perceptions. So because they are driven by, the attitudes are driven by subjective perceptions and beliefs, and these are largely informed by public debate, the question is, this is more a policy question actually, how to form an informed and fact-based public discourse in the first place, so that we could close this gap or disconnect between the reality or the facts and what people perceive. So here comes in the role of media. I think it's very important for media to be able to present factual knowledge. Whether they do it or not is a question. I guess there's some debate on that already. And the problem is that there's usually a selection on news media covering mainly negative news. So this is kind of steering a bit this kind of anti-immigrant sentiments as well. And framing is also very important. Which kind of vocabulary you use, which kind of titles, headlines you use when you talk about immigration in general, makes a difference at the end how people perceive things. And I was in an event 2 weeks ago, and someone mentioned that why do we use influx and inflow to describe migrant arrivals? Because these are terms used in physics for liquids and things like that, and we are, using these terms for people who are moving. So it's, this is maybe still nice ones. There could be worse vocabulary used for on these topics, and all these things. Aggregate to form the perceptions at the end. And so this you already mentioned, so it's not new, but I want to emphasize again this context theory and how the interaction between natives and foreign-born individuals could be promoted, so that, and this could be facilitated by local authorities. I think you've shared a very good example from Austria, where this was done in one of the papers that was reviewed, I think by you actually. So this is, I think, an important policy aspect, how to foster this facilitation, or how to foster the interaction between immigrants and natives so that they understand each other a bit more than just looking at the news and thinking about them from distance, but not really talking to them. And then learning from one another and sharing best practices, especially across countries, because some countries have done quite well in terms of receiving and integrating their immigrants. So some of the best practices could be shared with other countries, perhaps could be applied in some municipalities as well. And to be able to identify the measures, or for example in the news media or other political discourse, to identify them, hopefully correct them, in order to help this or counter these misperceptions, and to replace them with factually based evidence. And then, yes, this is going back to my initial. This is it's my last point. Is it to foster basically the close cooperation between the research, academic side, and the policies, to inform them with evidence and facts, so that the discourse that they lead is not just based on some exaggerated knowledge, but more on the facts. So I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.